Welcome and thanks for tuning in. I'm Andy Morimoto. I'm the Director of Climate Policy at Edelman Global Advisory and a Policy Fellow at the Paulson Institute. Today I'm pleased to be speaking with Dr. Joanna Lewis, who is the Provost Distinguished Associate Professor of Energy and Environment at Georgetown University, where she is also the Director of the Science, Technology, and International Affairs Program. Joanna is also the author of a terrific new book, which will be the focus of today's conversation, Cooperating for the Climate, Learning from International Partnerships in China's Clean Energy Sector. And I'm excited to dive into this today because, one, it's a hugely consequential topic. China is ground zero for both global emissions and for many of the world's climate solutions. And two, because Joanna has a very interesting thesis here, and it's one that goes against the grain in Washington these days, where there's a lot more talk today about energy trade wars and industrial policy and clean tech competition more than climate cooperation. So with that to tee you up, Joanna, let me first ask you, what motivated you to write this book and what do you think are its key contributions?
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Andy, for having me here to talk about the book. You know, this is something I've been thinking about for really over a decade now. You know, early in my career, I had the opportunity to do a lot of work, both through the national lab system as well as through various NGOs and foundations to work on the ground in China on a lot of clean energy and climate change cooperation projects, and just sort of experience, you know, firsthand and you know, what worked, what didn't work, what was often challenging, and also see the results of these sorts of cooperations and what they can actually bring, you know, to the table for both sides. And so that was really just, you know, experientially working in China, thinking about this. I became interested in a few years later about, you know, well, how could I maybe more systematically understand this issue of cooperation, and also to kind of bring it outside just the US-China frame. You know, one of the things I think is important, you know, here in Washington, we often kind of are very, you know, sort of siloed and think, I mean, obviously thinking about sort of US national interest, but there's a lot of experiences I try to bring in this book, which could be interesting to a US audience, but also bring on international experience, how different countries have cooperated with China over the last 3 decades. So really this, you know, the idea for writing this book came from both my experience working on the cooperation side as well as academically studying different cooperation activities and you know, US-China relations and relations with other countries. I think the key contributions of this book that I hope people will find useful, first of all, the data that I pulled together. So this, you know, there actually is no, there has been no sort of real documentation of bilateral agreements with China in the climate and energy space in sort of one centralized location. The people tend to not keep great information on this, you know, and bilateral agreements tend to be subject to, you know, sort of constantly changing political administrations, and these things are often not well archived. So one of the things that my research team and I did is to develop a new database of over 400 agreements with 43 countries, plus the EU, that look at these different bilateral arrangements with China in this area. And then we also, you know, taking this database, I dive in more detail into 3 specific case studies of cooperation with different countries. I think, you know, the other contributions are that, you know, I really try to examine cooperation within an integrated framework, which I propose, that combines the political, economic, and technical factors that I think really explain the rationale for and the structure of cooperation mechanisms. Often, I think in the past, when these things have been studied, we look just at the political or just at the technical rationale, but it's very clear that there are different ways countries approach these mechanisms with different you know, things they're hoping to get out of them, and this can be leveraged across both diplomatic and technical realms. And I come up with a way to try to illustrate, you know, how this has played out across different countries and different agreements over time. So So yeah, hopefully that, this combination of bringing this new data and this new framework to bear can help us think a little bit differently about how we examine cooperation.
That's great. And I want to get into a lot of that because there's so much in this book. So let's just start with a place where you start in the book. And there's a point that you make early on in chapter 1 that I don't really think has been fully absorbed into the American political system. And you write that technology and know-how are no longer flowing just to China, but also from China, and that China is no longer a technological follower. So can you just remind our listeners how this happened and how China became so dominant in the clean energy space to begin with?
Sure. When you go back to when you look at, I guess, China's sort of evolution in the clean energy technology space, I first started working in China in the early 2000s, and, going over there looking for to try to understand what was happening, particularly in the renewable energy technology space. And there was not a lot. This was really a time where most of China's leadership was actually pretty hesitant to promote clean energy technologies. They were at that point seen as, not cost competitive with more traditional energy technologies. And also, I think Chinese leadership recognized early on they didn't want to just be reliant on imported technology from other countries, which at that point was the case in wind turbines, solar panels, et cetera. But of course, China is very strategic about their science and technology planning and time, with very long time horizons, as well as their industrial policy planning, right? And this is something that has been criticized in the West, but is at the very least, you can say China has been transparent from the beginning about its ambitions, vis-a-vis technological independence and self-sufficiency. And, there are policy goals that, essentially said we want to work with foreign partners to understand state-of-the-art technology and be able to then bring this to China, so that we can essentially be the next leaders and the next frontier of innovation in key strategic industries, one of which is the clean energy industry. So you saw, and I think for the most part, you can actually map, and I actually did this in my first book for the wind power industry, map out, how China was able to become a leader in these technologies through international partnerships, through, primarily between private sector actors, through technology transfers, the vast majority of which were done, by commercially driven and negotiated contracts. And so, this was just, I think, what made China different about how they did this. I mean, all countries, participate in these technology transfers, but China was doing this as part of a much more broader vision and a strategic national plan with clean energy really at the core. So, one of the things I talk about in the book, particularly related to collaboration, is that a lot of the international engagement in the clean energy and climate space with China, a couple decades ago, was really about capacity building, helping China move away from its coal-based polluting energy system, particularly with global concern about China's contribution to carbon emissions. And so a lot of this focus was on how to essentially help China do this more quickly, more effectively. But this has really shifted, over the last 2 decades, where, we have now seen China deploy wind and solar farms at scale larger than anywhere else in the world. And with that comes, all this really interesting experience, including challenges and problems, right, with these projects. But it's essentially a global laboratory for large scale, gigawatt scale clean energy technology development. And you now see international partnerships really designed around not just, helping China do things, but how we can learn from what China has done, and bring that knowledge back to the United States and other countries. And so this is where I think we do need to recognize this is what drives sort of the rationale for engagement. It is no longer just about how we can sort of leverage China to do more, to reduce their emissions, to clean up their environment, but also, how this model has shifted, and China has become, no longer a technological follower, as it were. It's very important for us to be part of the energy technology decisions, and innovation being conducted in China, because the decisions made in China shape national industries, shape international industries, and because of the massive scale, has implications for just how these technologies are going to develop in the decade, how future technology and policy decisions will be made, both in the United States and around the world.
Right. That's something that we see at the Paulson Institute as well. We have this mayor's exchange program, and it's not just a matter of Chinese mayors coming to Chicago and these American cities and learning from American mayors. There's a lot that American political leaders and American mayors have learned from them about waste recycling, about energy efficiency, about a lot of these urban sustainability issues. So I want to get back to something that you mentioned in your first answer, which was about this incredible data set that you've mapped out of the bilateral clean energy and climate agreements with China. And what this shows, and what you've shown in a very comprehensive way, is how these different countries have pursued different types of clean energy partnerships with China. So can you just talk about these different models of international collaboration, and how are different industrialized countries leveraging China's strengths to their own benefits?
Sure. In the book, there's sort of a variety of ways I try to sort of tease out these different models of international collaboration. And one of the ways I do this is through examining these different case studies of how, for example, the US, but also Denmark and Brazil have engaged with China through three different models of Clean Energy Research Center with very different structures and aims. And what we see is that you can sort of extract these broader trends about how, and as we were talking about earlier, it used to be, when you had these technology focused partnerships, that this was really about, a country from the north, typically the US or Europe, sort of bringing that technology, or it could be the policies to support that technology, the experience and know-how, to China in this sort of, north to south unidirectional transfer, as we sort of think about this, right? And then that knowledge would be, sort of stay within China, within the Chinese context, and it was sort of a one-off. What I talk about in the book is how this model has really shifted, how, we actually see through specific bilateral partnerships. If you think about kind of the, a simple like linear model of innovation, where, typically you would have the innovation of a new technology would be done in the US and then maybe brought to China much later on in the stage. You actually now have this sort of innovation happening in the US, but maybe scaled very early on in China, brought to China because of the really unique aspects of China's clean energy innovation system, particularly the ability to demonstrate technologies at scale in a way that often we haven't been able to do successfully in other countries. And then that allows, not only that allows, foreign companies to benefit from these partnerships with China directly, and then bring that knowledge back to their home countries and to global markets. And so that's really been a shift of sort of integrating China within the kind of the global innovation system, but in a way that benefits not just China, but benefits the actual, the other countries that are involved in manufacturing and deploying these technologies. And then more recently, we've seen an even further shift in this model where, for example, in the case of a Brazil-China cooperation, you actually had a China innovated technology. So, a technology that came out of a spinoff from a Chinese university. And the inventors of this was an advanced biofuel technology, realized that, this had a lot of potential, but not necessarily in the Chinese market, given constraints on that technology within China. Realized that this could be scaled through a sort of a South-South partnership with Brazilian researchers, and then this allowed the technology to ultimately be commercialized and deployed within both countries, sort of, and in a way that, again, this sort of international innovation partnership wouldn't have been able to happen. And, likely this technology wouldn't have ever sort of seen the light of day without this international cooperation. So, I try to talk in the book, again, and this is an academic book, so we kind of get into the weeds on this, but ultimately, I think there's a lot of these sort of broader takeaways that a broader audience can sort of understand about China's shifting role in global innovation, given its really important scale and size, and contribution to energy markets and to the global climate challenge. And so if you understand sort of the benefits of integrating China in this over the past couple decades, it makes you sort of think maybe a little differently about how we should think about cooperation and how we can structure cooperation mechanisms so that they are in everyone's sort of self-interest, and how to sort of get the most out of them, not just from sort of a national political perspective, but also a global innovation perspective.
So that brings me to my next question. Can you talk a little bit about how you view China's motivations in this space? Because a lot of commentators, they'll look at what China is doing, and they'll assume it's because of it's because of an environmental imperative. They have air apocalypse to deal with, they have smog issues to deal with, so they need to deal with that. Others say that China's climate action is motivated by geoeconomic concerns, because they're racing to dominate the clean tech and clean industries of the future. Still others say that this is just a political play for the Chinese Communist Party to exert more influence. So when you look at these options, this menu of possibilities, what do you think are the biggest motivators for China's climate action?
Well, I mean, I think actually there is something to everything you just said, right? I mean, in many ways, there's not one answer to that question. And when we sort of talk about what motivates China, or the Chinese leadership, again, it's not necessarily a monolith, right? When we talk about China, there's really a diverse set of interests and actors, depending where you are, what level of government, what part of the country. And so I think that motivation for climate action really does vary across actors, and even across ministries, within the Chinese political system. I think environmental issues have grown in importance in China. We know this, but again, I think, as you mentioned, a lot of the environmental focus in China has been more local. Direct air pollution, water pollution issues that directly threaten public health. Within the Chinese context, though, there are direct linkages between local environmental issues and global climate change, because a lot of the sources of these pollutants are coming from fossil fuels, and for the most part, China's coal dominant energy system. So, it's in some ways, a different set of issues, and there's actually now sort of different political actors that focus on these different issues, but a lot of co-benefits within the Chinese context, in most cases, for essentially addressing the coal transition and the benefits that would have more broadly on local environmental issues as well as on global climate change. I think the other piece you mentioned, that was extremely important, and as I mentioned earlier, when we look at China's real clean energy push and the amazing achievements China's been able to achieve in the last decade of really becoming a global leader in the manufacturing and deployment of almost every clean energy technology, I think it's safe to say this is not primarily driven by climate change concerns. This is really, as I mentioned earlier, just part of this much broader strategic economic policy and industrial policy, where the government has really been trying to make China, a more innovation-based economy, less reliant on foreign technologies, and to do this in very strategic industries where there is going to be a future global market. I mean, the writing was on the wall 20 years ago that ultimately we're all going to need clean energy technologies if we're going to take climate change seriously. And so I think, the Chinese leadership did have the foresight to kind of position themselves Of course, this has led to a lot of political and economic tensions with China, as others have, sort of declined in their market share as China has risen. But I think that it's economic and industrial policy is now playing an even larger role in climate policy in this country, right? And so I think that this is again something that we're seeing really this shift happen around the world.
Right. So this is all happening against the backdrop of increasing geopolitical competition and technological competition. And this is all bleeding into the climate space. But in your book, you described that in the not too distant past, the US and China had a relatively productive climate relationship, particularly in the Bush and Obama years. So can you give an example or two of some of the most impactful partnerships our two countries have pursued on climate during that time?
Sure. So, in this book, I do try to sort of document the last 30 years or so of bilateral cooperation. And I, have a specific chapter that talks about the US China relationship because it is so important ultimately, given our respective contributions to the global climate problem and the fact that we have actually a lot of shared challenges in the energy transition, particularly. I think in terms of two partnerships I would talk about briefly that have been, I think, particularly impactful. Both actually occurred during, or at least both were initiated during the Obama administration. So the first was the US China Clean Energy Research Center, or the CERC as it was called, which was one of the first bilateral partnerships that got off the ground in the early years of the Obama administration. And really, the rationale for this, it came out of, many years and decades of energy technology cooperation that was happening through the U.S. Department of Energy with Chinese partners through the national labs. And but what this partnership did was sort of shift that prior bilateral partnership, which again had been this little bit more unidirectional, capacity focused, and make this a truly joint partnership, in that it was, from the beginning, you had 50-50 financing for the activities under the agreement. All the projects were joint, bringing in companies, researchers, and officials from both sides, from China and the United States, working side by side. And so, again, this wasn't just a unidirectional, this was very joint. The agenda for the partnership was set jointly. There were 3 and then 5 consortia that addressed a whole variety of clean energy technology areas that were identified as strategic priorities for both countries, right? And so there were just a lot of really interesting and novel things about the CERC that hadn't been done. Also, just the scale of the CERC had never been done before. I mean, there were hundreds and hundreds of people involved in hundreds of projects across both countries, students trained, many publications, even some patents that came out of this joint work. And so it was just novel in its the parity given to both countries in contributing to the projects, as well as just the massive scale and the focus on really clean energy technology innovation, but also demonstration and deployment across different projects. The other novel thing about this, just briefly, which I talk a lot about in the book, is that this was one of the few bilateral partnerships that really addressed the concerns about intellectual property head on. And so, there are obviously real risks to doing any kind of international cooperation across borders, and particularly always concerns working in an emerging economy like China with a less developed intellectual property, protection system. But the CERC realized that, they didn't want intellectual property risks and concerns to sort of, not allow real engagement to happen on important technology issues. So they designed an entire framework around addressing that. The other thing I would maybe mention, which is that was a very technology focused agreement, right? And there are other bilateral programs that have been much more focused on diplomatic outcomes. And one of those was the Climate Change Working Group, which was established when former Secretary Kerry took over back in 2013 in the State Department. And it was the first time that the US and China had a sort of a high level dialogue explicitly on climate change issues, as opposed to climate sort of being part of a broader, strategic economic dialogue or sort of other lower level or, sort of working level engagement. And so really elevating it to that level set the groundwork for a meaningful back and forth, which, I think clearly paved the way for what would become the Paris Agreement at the end of 2015. Many people point to the bilateral engagement between the US and China, most notably the 2014 joint statement that both countries released a year ahead of Paris, where they announced their pledges, their international climate pledges under the Paris Agreement. And that really just set the stage for the rest of the world to say, okay, the U.S. and China are taking this seriously. They're working together. This really sent an important signal to the rest of the world to step up as well and put targets on the table. And that's ultimately, I think, what led to the success of the Paris Agreement.
Right. So a lot of those scientific exchanges you mentioned, science exchanges, technological exchanges, the politics of these have become a lot more fraught in recent years. So can you fast forward to today and talk about how that breakdown has occurred and what you see as some of the biggest hurdles today for U.S.-China climate cooperation?
Yes, I mean, I think while cooperation on climate change has historically been rather insulated from broader tensions, particularly in the U.S.-China bilateral relationship, we really see climate solutions being more and more about competition in technology, right, and in clean energy innovation. And so, while in the past we've been able to do this clean energy technology cooperation in a way that has led to important changes in China's domestic climate and energy policy, I think now there are just real concerns in the US and elsewhere about the broader economic and security risks to engaging in the technology space, particularly in the new and emerging technology areas where the US, wants to play a very important role in innovation and manufacturing going forward. I think one of the things I talk about in the book, but also in the sort of more recent work that I'm doing on looking at clean energy supply chains and sort of where we are with all of this. I think we need to look. How do I put this? I think the past experience I show in this book, even if times are different now, in terms of today's political realities, I do think that I'm able to demonstrate that we actually know how to design cooperation mechanisms that are adaptable to different geopolitical environments and that can, address the specific risks that could be associated with technology cooperation as opposed to dismissing them. I mean, I think the CERC was a great idea, or I'd say a great example of a very ambitious project that would be very difficult to do today due to political concerns about science and technology cooperation in this area, but was not naive about the real risks of intellectual property leakage and therefore designed, very robust IP agreement that ended up being enforced many times. Many U.S. companies were actually able to leverage this high-level diplomatic agreement to improve their sort of day-to-day workings with Chinese partners on the ground because of the political cover that being part of a large bilateral agreement gave to U.S. companies that were really involved in technology collaborations, and they were doing so because that was their own business model, their own self-interest. So I think that the biggest hurdles today are these broader concerns about, ceding competition to China in strategic clean energy technology industries, and even more so, the sort of broader national security risks that this could result in. But I would just say that while there are real risks, and I don't, I'm not at all sort of dismissing that we need to be smart about how to do this and design programs strategically. My point is that we shouldn't not cooperate because of these concerns. We actually know how to design programs around these risks to manage these risks, and the benefit, to the United States of participating in these programs is so vast that just not doing them will really be ultimately to our detriment. As would, sort of fully removing China from the clean energy innovation and manufacturing system. And I think there are ways that other players can contribute. We do want a more diverse supply chain for a variety of reasons, but again, I think there are ways to do this that are smart and are not just sort of come from unfounded political concerns, but rather are based on evidence, and designed around how we can do these partnerships to directly benefit the United States and other partners, as well as benefit the global climate.
So how do you think about that shift to this era of climate competition, though, and not only the risks that this might pose, but also some have argued that even though we're moving to this more competitive climate relationship with China, that might not be the end of the world. Perhaps climate competition or this clean energy race will actually produce better outcomes than an approach that emphasizes cooperation. So just how would you respond to that sort of view?
Sure. Competition is good, right? We all know that. It can encourage innovation that might not happen otherwise. But at the same time, when we look at something like climate change, right, where there is a relatively short time horizon remaining to move the world to a new emissions trajectory. Essentially, we are in the pivotal decade for addressing climate change and not ruling out the most ambitious climate targets that have been put forth by the IPCC to avoid the most dangerous impacts of climate change. We don't have time to develop multiple duplicative supply chains in every country around the world that would like to, build their own solar panels or their own wind turbines. And thinking about this, from a purely national perspective, just doesn't make sense when you're dealing with a global problem like climate change, right? So I think we need to, I think competition is good in that. I would argue, we might not have gotten the IRA, here in the United States, if we weren't concerned about how the U.S. is going to play competitively, with China and other countries in the clean energy technology space in the coming decades. Everyone wants to benefit from building out these new industries, from local jobs, right, that they provide. And I think that's very important to the political economy of the climate transition. This is something, we've been seeing for quite a long time. But, again, we need to do this through smart economic policy, smart national security policy that doesn't overly constrain innovation and the global deployment of these technologies, and ensures that they are still affordable for the global South. Most of the renewable energy technology that's going to need to be deployed in the next 2 decades is not in the United States. It's in the developing world. It's in Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and where are these countries going to get affordable, low carbon technologies? And so, if the U.S. wants to help play that role, that's great. But for the most part, these technologies are being sourced from China, and we've seen the costs. We saw the cost of solar energy decline by over 90% last decade, and that has amazing implications for affordability. So we just need to look at this from a global perspective and think about how competition can help us, with this climate challenge, as well as help, the U.S.'s own competitiveness vis-a-vis other countries.
Right. So when you look at the U.S. government approach today, and what the Biden administration is doing in handling the China relationship, what are some practical steps that you think we could take to rebuild the bilateral relationship with China on this issue of climate change? And what are the areas that you think are most ripe for cooperation?
Well, I think there's a lot that could be done, but I do think we need to sort of think about new models of bilateral cooperation that may look a little different from the ones I write about in the book and that have been successful in the past. Because this is a constantly changing environment. I think one area where I think we really have not been doing enough, and we could be much more strategic about engaging with China bilaterally is for this issue of clean energy finance in the developing world. As I mentioned, this is just one of the biggest challenges is going to be how most of the global south is able to do a successful low carbon energy transition, not only given the financing needs, but the broader shifts that have to happen on the ground to create a more sort of viable enabling environment. Shifting the sort of political economy, addressing vested interests, setting up policy frameworks. There's just a lot that has to happen on the ground. Risk management, like de-risking financial instruments that will actually allow a lot of the investment to happen in these countries, which can be, more challenging investment environments. And so, we've seen China bring the scale, massive scale of energy infrastructure investment to a lot of the developing world, including through the Belt and Road Initiative. But for the past decade, most of that investment has been in coal plants and in hydropower plants, which have a lot of environmental impact. Coal plants, of course, have major carbon emissions impact, and so I think the United States should be thinking about what are the things you could be doing to leverage some of this Chinese investment towards cleaner sources of energy. So not necessarily like matching China, trying to match China dollar for dollar. I don't think that's possible, but there's a lot that we can bring to the table in these countries. We have a lot of work there already in terms of enabling environments, capacity building, this more traditional bilateral cooperation, but doing this in a way where we're having conversations with the Chinese about how this can be going towards more sustainable energy projects. We saw a really significant high-level pledge from the Chinese president at the end of 2021 that they were not going to finance coal plants abroad any longer. And I think this was very much a result of international pressure in this direction. And so I think that is a very ripe area for continued engagement. There's a lot of other areas where I know the United States is trying to engage more with China, including on methane emissions. This is a really large source of greenhouse gas emissions in China, which is not currently included in most of its national climate change targets. And this is also an area where there's a lot of work happening domestically, where China as well wants to get better data, better oversight of emissions there. So, important cooperation happening across multiple U.S. agencies there. But I think ultimately, we need to be at the table. We need to be engaging with China, not just bilaterally, but bringing them into other multilateral conversations that are really, sort of bringing to the table important shifts in everything from energy infrastructure to climate finance to technology innovation issues. There's a lot of these sort of smaller groupings of countries, Mission Innovation and others, that are about thinking through how to do this sort of clean energy cooperation that we've mostly done bilaterally, and thinking about how to multilateralize it and look for real synergies in innovation and do this in a way that can help deploy technologies more quickly. China just has to be involved in these conversations, and the U.S. should be playing a really important role in continuing to lead in these conversations as well.
Well, one final question, and that's how to bring the private sector in and how to engage businesses in the U.S.-China climate cooperative relationship. So as you've written in your book, the private sector has played a very big role in a lot of these partnerships. So what are some of the key lessons that you believe companies should take away from your book, and how can they manage the risks of climate cooperation with China, and how can they seize the opportunities?
Yeah, I think, obviously, when we talk about sort of government to government partnerships, um, I think they can have a very important role in the ultimate, in what we do in the entire energy sector in China, because nothing in China sort of is without the approval of the state, right? And I mean, the state sort of has a hand in everything, which is why in this project I focus specifically on these sort of government to government initiatives. But within all of them, the private sector plays in a very important role. And, it's really been the public-private partnerships like the CERC that have been, I think, the most robust in producing results. I think one of the things that surprised me most in doing the research for this book was that, the risks to technology cooperation with China, I think really are not about these kind of tangible issues like intellectual property theft. Not to say that's not an important issue, and I've written a lot about this, and it has happened, but can be managed in many ways. Our companies are at the front line of sort of how to do this in a smart way. Particularly companies that really have seen massive benefit to working in China and don't want to give up that market. I think much more challenging to the relationship is just this broader sort of geostrategic risk associated with helping China build up its scientific and technical capacity, because we have played a role in this, and again, we have benefited from it. But China is now, among a sort of a very different tier of countries in terms of where it is, in terms of its own scientific and technical capabilities, right? Where it is, really up there on par with, the sort of leading innovative countries, that we've always sort of fancied ourselves as a leader, and everyone else is far behind. And I think, right, that this is sort of no longer the reality, in a variety of industries. So I think that there are benefits to doing technology cooperation that outweigh the risks. I guess just more broadly, the scope of global interaction among our scientists, the integration of our economies, right, is just unprecedented in history. And so I think that, from the private sector perspective, but also just more broadly, I think that I hope that this book shows that fruitful cooperation with China is indeed possible and in our national interests, if you design any partnership, to optimize political and technological benefit and address risks head on.
That's wonderful. Joanna, thank you so much for your time. This has been great. Lots to chew on, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Great. Thank you.